Hello, everyone. My name is Betty Cruz, and I'm with the World Affairs Council of Pittsburgh. Welcome to our first program of 2022. It is so great to be here with you today. We're here virtually, and we're going to be in person in the next couple of months, so stick with us and please follow along as we have a lot packed for the months ahead, especially in March, when we're looking forward to some exciting hybrid programming. So we want everyone to keep joining us from around the world, as well as in person. Can't come soon enough. Our mission at the council is to convene and connect people around global issues to build a thriving, competitive, and inclusive Pittsburgh. And our vision is for a globally minded and globally connected world that is equitable and just for all. Today's program, Toward a Better, Safer, More Resilient, and More Prosperous World, is in partnership with the U.S. Army War College and will be moderated by Megan Andros, a senior program officer at the Heinz Endowments, responsible for the Foundation's Veterans and Military Families Initiative, a really exciting initiative that is only one of a handful in the country. This initiative seeks to improve reintegration outcomes for the estimated 5,200 veterans plus family members that move to the Pittsburgh and Western Pennsylvania region each year. Before joining the endowments, Megan served for 5 years as an ordnance officer in the Army's 1st Cavalry Division. Megan is currently a veteran fellow at Stanford University's Hoover Institution. It's now my pleasure to turn it over to Megan Andros to lead today's program. Megan, take it away.
Thank you so much, Betty, and thank you for trusting me to guide what I'm sure will be a wonderful conversation today. As Betty mentioned, I'm currently a senior program officer at the Heinz Endowments, where I'm responsible for our foundation's Veterans and Military Family Strategy. Before joining the endowments, I spent 9 years as a Department of Defense employee, 4 as a cadet at the United States Military Academy at West Point, followed by 5 on active duty as an ordnance officer in the Army. And I spent most of my time in the military with the 1st Cavalry Division, as Betty mentioned, both in Fort Hood, Texas, and in Iraq. I would now like to turn it over to our panelists to introduce themselves, the stars of our show today, beginning with Colonel Kevin Payne from the U.S. Army War College. Colonel Payne, please take it away.
Thank you, Megan. So good afternoon, everyone. I'd like to thank the World Affairs Council for inviting us to be here with you today. Before we get into the program, I wanted to provide a little bit of context about what the Army War College is, what our Eisenhower program does, and then we'll get into the individual introductions. So first, the War College. The Army War College is located in Carlisle, Pennsylvania, and it's our senior school for educating Army officers. When officers reach the rank of lieutenant colonel or equivalent, they compete for the selective opportunity to attend War College, where they receive 10 months of graduate education, which helps prepare them for the next level of responsibility as senior leaders within our armed forces. One of the goals of the Army War College is to help prepare these expert military practitioners to advise policymakers who might lack extensive military knowledge or experience. But to be effective advisors, our students really strive to become better and more effective communicators with civilians like yourselves, and by better explaining our own military perspectives and understanding your perspectives as well. So now about the Eisenhower Series College Program, better known as ESCP. It's more than 50 years old, and our goal is to bridge the civil-military divide and improve mutual understanding of national security issues. We do that by engaging in dialogue with college campuses and community groups around the country, where we speak with people interested in security issues who likely don't have much military experience. It's exactly the kind of people our graduates will be working with. ESCP is an elective for our students, and as students, I'm a student as well. We strive to broaden our knowledge by researching the topics we present to you. Thus, we should not be considered true subject matter experts on the topic, but rather we provide an informed military perspective on the subject. You've read the bios of our panelists, and the 3 of us come from a variety of military and civilian backgrounds, and we'll present a diverse set of topics that cover a broad context of national security. But finally, I need to add this disclaimer. I want you to understand that the opinions that we express here today are our own and do not necessarily represent the official position of the Department of Defense. So my next task, I guess you've seen my bio. We talked about ESCP, but one thing I want to touch upon is one of my experiences in Afghanistan. So specifically, it was Task Force Shafafia. Task Force Shafafia was a counter-corruption organization which worked with the International Security Assistance Force. And we worked with the Afghan ministries on identifying, investigating, and educating the police and the army on corruption. And we also worked on the implementation of counter-corruption programs throughout the country. A very difficult task. It challenged the legitimacy of the Afghan government, but it's something that we're very proud of. And there are lots of lessons learned that I think we can use in future events. And another topic I want to touch on briefly is some of the diversity, equity, inclusion focused work that I've done in my career. Most recently, I was the chief of the Command and Tactics Division, which is responsible for educating and training military police lieutenants and captains in Fort Leonard Wood at the MP school. I worked on a team who developed curriculum for the military police school, and specifically it was titled Cultural Competency in Policing. The course was designed to educate MPs on the cultural considerations inherent in policing populations. So that's something that I've done related to DEI. But now I will turn it over to Mr. Rossman for his introduction.
Thank you, Colonel Payne. I very much appreciate that. It's very nice to be with everyone today. As Colonel Payne said, my name is Mike Rossman. I'm a Foreign Service Officer with the U.S. Agency for International Development and a civilian student at the Army War College. The agency I work for is the lead government agency for overseas humanitarian assistance and humanitarian development assistance. And for the Eisenhower Speaker Program, I have prepared conversations about soft power and about climate change impacts using South Asia as a case study. Why am I here today is that U.S. assistance or U.S. foreign assistance has always had the purpose of furthering American interests while improving lives in the developing world. As the lead U.S. agency within the United States government, USAID, which is the acronym for the United States Agency for National Development, works in more than 100 countries, providing humanitarian and emergency relief during disasters, both man-made and natural. And we also provide long-term sustainable development assistance, including vaccine diplomacy, climate change adaptation and mitigation assistance, and health education and democratic institution building programs. I'd like to highlight part of our work today that we have Reverend Paul Abernathy with us. Is a lot of our work is with local communities overseas in the host countries in which we work. And more as development professionals and its institutions, we're realizing that the key to our success is to listen and implement ideas and solutions generated by local communities. And from those ideas, our role is to support and enable them to better engage and meet those priorities. And to do this, every day now we're learning and we're using new tools and institutionalizing new priorities with a community focus to improve our results and to make a more prosperous, safe, and democratic world. I've been with AID for 20 years. I've worked in many developing countries in Asia, Africa, the Caribbean, and Europe, including Afghanistan and Haiti, to try and, on the behalf of the US government, to help people work towards increased democratic values and institutions and their human and country development. I most recently lived for 4 years in Georgia, which is a small country in the Caucasus, just to the south of Russia and next to the Black Sea. And Georgia is a post-Soviet state, and later we'll be talking about Ukraine. Like Ukraine, it gained its independence after the fall of the Soviet Union. And since that time, Georgia chose democratic values as its guiding principle. And you can imagine how dangerous this is when Russia is your northern neighbor. In fact, they fought several conflicts with Russia, the most recent in 2008, and are currently suffering through what's called a frozen conflict, where Russia controls almost 20% of their territory. So while I worked there for my 4 years, I very much was pleased to support them as they tried to grow the democratic values against adversity. And we still continue to help them today. We'll talk more about this later. I look forward to discussing my agency's efforts in support of national security and soft power with you today, and thank you very much for the opportunity. I'd now like to allow Reverend Abernathy to introduce himself.
Thank you, Mr. Rossman. Hello, my name is Father Paul Abernathy. I'm the Chief Executive Officer of the Neighborhood Resilience Project. I'm an Orthodox Christian priest, and our work at the Neighborhood Resilience Project is really focusing on how we move from trauma-affected community to resilient, healing, and healthy community through trauma-informed community development. Much of my approach to this work on a local level, as Mr. Rossman alluded to, actually comes from my military experience as a soldier in Iraq as a combat engineer with the 3rd Infantry Division. I, from that time until now, have had to wrestle with the impact of hard power and violence on life in community and how we help move forward to a brighter future in the aftermath of tragedy. Beyond my military experience and certainly theological training, I have a background in public international affairs and have had the opportunity to study in the Middle East, in particular in Syria at the University of Aleppo before the war, and then to spend time at the Patriarchate of Antioch in Damascus, Syria, to go to Israel, Palestine on a fact-finding commission, and also to Lebanon as part of official church business. The international perspective that I've gained with populations in the Middle East struggling to work with very challenging political economic conditions really gives some strong insight for me in terms of how we go from large policy decisions to really implementing real change on the ground. I can remember very vividly during the war in Iraq how soldiers really were charged with implementing large policy in villages, in blocks, in towns across a foreign nation, and how different it seemed to be from the conversations and decisions that were being made half a world away. I'm very excited to be part of this conversation and certainly humbled to be in the company of my esteemed guest, Megan. Thank you so much. I will turn it over to you.
So thank you so much for telling us about your individual areas of interest and expertise. You all are incredible, obviously, so I can tell this is going to be a great discussion. So now we'll jump right into our moderated discussion before we open the floor for audience questions. If you're watching on Zoom, please submit your questions for our panelists in the question and answer feature. And if you're joining us live on YouTube, you can drop your questions in the chat there. So I'd like to start off by referencing the White House's interim national security strategic guidance, in which President Biden writes that, quote, "In this moment of accelerating global challenges, we will only succeed in advancing American interests and upholding our universal values by working in common cause with our closest allies and partners, and by renewing our own enduring sources of national strength," end quote. So what do you all see as the enduring sources of national strength in the United States? And how can our country leverage those strengths in this moment of accelerating global challenges? So I invite you all to answer this question. I'd like to start with Colonel Payne, please.
Thanks, Megan. That's an amazing question because we can take it so many different directions. In my career and through my academic studies, I understand that there are several sources of national strength mentioned in the interim national security guidance, but I just want to touch upon a couple, which I think have directly influenced me in my career. I think the first one for me is our alliances and partnerships. I've had the privilege of serving side by side with international partners, both in deployed environments and here in the United States. And the relationships and opportunities to learn and what I learned in those experiences will remain with me forever. For perspective, I sponsored a Romanian officer in one of our schools, and he was in my basement on 9/11 when I was in school as a lieutenant. He's now a brigade commander. I'm going to be a brigade commander, and we still maintain that relationship. One of the things that we do is invite partner nations to our military academic institutions, and the dialogue which occurs there provides a unique perspective, and it adds depth to the overall learning experience. I think we need to continue to strengthen these relationships and repair any relationships which were damaged in the past few years. And I also believe that the current challenges globally require collective action within the international community. Needless to say, we're in the midst of a pandemic, which can affect all aspects of life, to include the economic, social, and et cetera. So we're best and we operate best as a nation when our alliances and partnerships are strong. The last area I'll touch on this question is the strength of our democracy, our values, our way of life. from traveling around the world, and I know my fellow panelists have done this as well, they understand that we're fortunate to live in a society where divergent thoughts and beliefs are not only freely expressed, but valued. It's hard to put it in perspective, really, until you've traveled to countries where these aspects of society are not valued and they're muted. The strength of our nation is the strength of our discourse and our dialogue. And I do believe that that's something that, as I looked at the interim national security guidance and deliberated on it, those are the two things that stuck out with me, Megan.
Thank you so much. Mr. Rossman, Reverend or Father Paul, sorry. Would you either of you like to chime in on that question?
Father Paul, please.
No. Well, I was going to say the same. I would simply say, I think firstly, along with Colonel Payne's, perspective, I would absolutely agree that democracy, and in particular, our emphasis on human dignity and human rights, I believe makes us, moral leaders in the world, and is a source of real strength, and certainly a beacon for many people around the world in many different cultural contexts. Beyond that, I think that we historically have been brilliant problem solvers. The ingenuity and innovation that has characterized American life, I believe, has set us far beyond many other societies, in that we value it, we promote it, and have historically, I think, nurtured it. And that propensity to solve problems, even as we have seen in the context of a pandemic, having a vaccine within a year after the actual virus was identified, is extraordinary, and I think a testament to our ingenuity and innovation. And thirdly, I would simply say the propensity to look forward, not backward. My uncle used to say that Americans have a 2-week mentality. He would see these big crises in the media, and it would be such a big problem. And sometimes leaders would be under deep scrutiny or whatever the crisis might be. And he'd say to me repeatedly, don't worry, in 2 weeks, Americans will look forward to something else. And I think that forward-looking aspect of American culture has given us really the ability to go beyond, even go beyond thinking about ancient enemies, thinking about how enemies of the past could be allies of the future. And all that comes with the ability to look forward, I think, is a great strength for Americans.
What a great point, Father Paul. Thank you so much. I'm now going to sort of turn to a discussion about hard and soft power. And I want to direct this next question to Mr. Rossman. Could you please describe the difference between soft power and hard power for those of us who may be unfamiliar with that concept?
It'd be my pleasure to, Megan. Thank you for the opportunity. Let's start off with a definition of power. What is power? And power is defined as the ability to influence the behavior of others to get what you want. And there are several ways for a country to use power to influence another country to get what you want. You can coerce them with threats. You can induce them economically through sanctions, or you can draw others to do what you want from the attractiveness of your goals, values, and foreign policies. This goes back to your previous question. If you're nice guys, people like you, and they may do what you like and what you would want for their interest and your interest. And let me describe an example of soft power. Let me start with hard power. When I was in Georgia, for example, and in other countries this happens, we have military assistance and cooperation. And when I was there, there was an Army colonel who worked with, as a defense attaché, who worked with the Georgians, his military counterparts, to ensure that Georgia had the means to defend itself. And that would be through shared training and exercises. And you've probably read about the US provides military equipment to help countries defend themselves. That's classic military hard power. As I said earlier, soft power attracts. It's when you work cooperatively. And it's different from using military force or economic sanctions. Soft power is promoting our human rights, our free speech and association, democracy, human rule of law, aspects that are part of our culture. And through USAID, my organization, there's also the US government as part of whole of government, providing soft power assistance, first short term, which could be helping to mitigate disasters, For instance, we will be there if there's a hurricane in the Caribbean. USAID is there. We're also working longer term with countries to help them develop their democratic institutions, to help what's important to people living there, which is educational systems, helping their health system, helping them learn how to vote if there are issues with their democracy, all to get better. The Department of State also exercises soft power. They use soft power through what's called public diplomacy, where they actually have information campaigns where they describe US values, what we believe in, our culture. And then also I want to just add Department of Defense is a part of our soft power as well. I said their military is hard, but they're also soft. In the Caribbean, if there's a hurricane, we often within the US government rely on the military through their capacities of sea lift, airlift, to provide that immediate assistance to help folks survive and begin recovery. And I also want to throw in unofficial soft power. I hope I'm not going too long, but there's also unofficial soft power. Just as we were talking before, the transparent influence of our democracy, free markets, the sharing of culture through platforms like Netflix, which if you're a curious person like me, translates to 20 different languages and portrays our culture in a way. And also with Father Paul here through NGOs, which work overseas very diligently and practice US values and demonstrate how we attract, how we want to cooperate, and that every day you can see we're exercising soft power to help folks to understand other people in other countries and their governments to understand that aligning with the United States is in their interest. And further, as a realist and pragmatically, that gaining their assistance helps us to protect our national security, our values, our freedoms. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that answer. And it sounds like my follow-up is going to be, how do we balance hard and soft power? But in your example, it's pretty clear that that's done globally on a daily basis.
It is, Megan. We use a whole of government approach. When I'm in an embassy, there's something called a country team, which every week the ambassador gets everyone around a table and there's coordination of our activities. And in that country team, hard and soft power are balanced, if you will, for their influence. So let me give you an example of where hard power is helping us right now. As you all know, there's in the South China Sea right now, there's disputes over who controls the South China Sea, with China being very aggressive in establishing itself as controlling a large part of the ocean and lands very close to lands of other people, which has not historically been true. In practical terms, the US has a military defense treaty with the Philippines, which is under threat from China. And we are allied with the Philippines to provide hard power through our defense to protect them. At the same time, I worked in the Philippines. USAID is in the Philippines, and we are working with the Filipinos for more than 60 years, providing them help during their typhoons. The Philippines is very disaster prone, and providing longer term assistance to them as well, education, health, again, as I was mentioning earlier. And the benefit of this is that for historic reasons, the Filipinos like us, but also with all the work we've been doing for 60 years, we have, through our sustained commitment to the Filipinos and their well-being, we have their friendship.
Sure.
And when you're looking towards a competition with China and the South China Seas, having the Philippines nearby as a friendly nation, an allied nation, should make us all feel better, because it will just help save lives. It may deter aggression, and I think lead us to a path maybe of peace and a better world as we work to compete with China, and then at times perhaps even confront them when they go too far. Thank you.
One last follow-up, and then I'll give you a break, I promise. So post-Afghanistan and Iraq, the United States is shifting its focus to preparing for a great power competition rather than an insurgency. So could you, we've all been watching the situation unfold in Ukraine. Given your expertise in Georgia, and since it's such a close neighbor there, obviously, can you talk about how America is leveraging soft power to prevent conflict and preparing to leverage hard power if the situation unfortunately does escalate?
Yes, thanks, Megan. We're talking about that every day in our classes, what's going on, the twists and turns of that situation, which of course we all hope ends up peacefully. But let me describe this. It's not either or with with power, hard and soft power. It's both, I think, is the key here. And which do you use at the appropriate time, or which is maybe preeminent? And right now, I'd have to say for the Ukraine, we're using many instruments of national power to support Ukraine. But right now, the emphasis is on hard power. And the hard power right now, you may everyone be familiar with, the president placed 8,500 troops on alert. That deters Russian aggression. We've also said to the Russians that if they attack Ukraine, we will cut off the SWIFT bank network, which will make it hard for the Russians to function economically. So there's a lot of hard power going on. Soft power, I think, is generally conceived as taking longer. And I want to say that the US government, USAID specifically, as working for the whole of government, has been in Ukraine for more than 30 years. And the impact of our soft power, I think, is what you see, and actually I want to also throw in the soft power of our allies, is what you see right now. The Ukrainians have decided to pursue a democratic and Western-leading approach, to be a Western-leading and democratic country. And that was never a given when they gained their independence. You could look at Belarus, which just had essentially democracy cut off with Russian help. And that the fact that the Ukrainians are resolved to maintain their independence, to resolve their differences at the ballot box, and to share values, democratic values, with us and with Europe, I think that's the victory of soft power. And that without soft power, that just may not have happened.
Thank you for that. Take a break. Father Paul, I want to turn to you. Given your deep expertise working with individuals and communities to overcome trauma in the States and our community, how do you believe trauma affects, perhaps disrupts, the effectiveness of soft and hard power when it is deployed overseas?
Yes, well, I think really as it relates to any potential use of hard power, I think one of the things I've learned in my life is we have to think really beyond this generation. In fact, if we look, for example, in the Middle East, we might say some of the extremism that exists in the Middle East really is not rooted in the violence of today, but actually goes back to violence of previous generations. Actually, a lot of people talk about ancient violence, but really much of it is rooted in the 20th century. And what happened, we're talking about Sykes-Picot Agreement in the aftermath of World War I. We're talking about, the wars with Israel. We're talking about, the different challenges and tensions with the Sunni Shia rival between Saudi Arabia and Iran. We see that there has to be, we have to understand really what is the consequence. And I think the big question is not only what is the challenge of today, but the decisions of today, how they affect the outcomes of tomorrow. And I'm talking even about 2, 3, 4, 5, our Native American brothers and sisters, they would say 7 generations out. I would also argue that that really any potential use of hard power, we then must understand soft power. And I think we've tried to do this as a nation as a way to really potentially heal the wounds that absolutely happen with the use of hard power, because there has to be a concerted effort to really help nations rebound, to help communities rebound. And truthfully, when we get into very local communities, so we think about these very grand political ideas, but what I've learned is when you really get on the local level, people in many instances are just trying to survive, and they're not always that interested in what are really the political motivations for a particular use of hard power. The question becomes how a use of power affects life on the streets, or how even people perceive the use of power, hard or soft, affects life in villages, real life, these sort of, like we would say in America, the kitchen table issues. Well, that happens all around the world. So what we have to understand is that with any potential use of power, hard or soft, the impact of trauma on that population, there has to be an intentional effort to help the population heal so as to undermine any potential future extremism that is rooted in wounds that people suffer as a result of power.
Thank you, Father Paul. All right, I'd now like to shift to another important conversation, which is diversity, equity, and inclusion in the United States military. I've heard many scholars over the years remark that the United States military is one of the most egalitarian and diverse organizations in the country, and one that the corporate sector should take lessons from. So Colonel Payne, can you talk to us about the benefits of the structural makeup of the military and your own experience as it relates to diversity and inclusion in the Army?
Sure, thanks. That's a great question, and a really, really important topic. It's something that I'm very, very passionate about. Um, I think I could take it back even before my time in the military and my upbringing, uh, both in an inner city environment and then moving to a community which was located in the shadow of a large university. So there's benefits obviously to each one, but the educational aspects of the latter really helped me and taught me about diversity, because many times I would be the only African American in the room. And it's something that I've also experienced in the military. But as it relates to the structural makeup of the U.S. Army, I believe in the power of diversity in team building and team composition. Every time I meet somebody new, I talk to them. Hey, where are you from? South Dakota. Oh, you're the first person I met from South Dakota. Tell me about South Dakota. But it's a two-way conversation. So it's me learning from them and them learning from me. And I think that that learning experience and that growth and development becomes exponential in nature when you have diverse teams. Now, the Army has several new initiatives, relatively new initiatives, about a year old, where they're focusing more on diversity and inclusion. And I think that bodes well for the Army in the long run. But what's important to me is the individual professional development, mentorship, and counseling as you begin to open up new opportunities for different types of people. You can put all types of people in a room, but if a leader, a senior leader, is not spending time learning about them and developing them and engaging in that two-way conversation, then in 5 years, where are we? The Army's gotten better. We cherish diversity. We encourage diversity. There are no quotas or anything like that, but the Army attempts to diversify all levels of leadership. We're getting better. We're not there yet, but we're getting better. And I think that that's the biggest lesson that I would pass on as it relates to the structural makeup, and whether it related to the racial composition, gender, equity, across the board. I think that we lead the way in that category.
So can you give me one or two specific things that you think communities in the United States, perhaps the corporate sector and abroad, could sort of take from the military and leverage to become more like the military in this way?
Yes. My daughter works in the civilian sector, and she tells me stories of situations which in the military would be cause for alarm. I think that we cherish the education of our employees. We spend tens of thousands of dollars educating at every step of the professional development. We spend tens of thousands of dollars, as evidenced by myself at the War College along with Mr. Rossman, is we cherish that aspect of professional development. And I think that there are individual problems which the Army does not turn their back. If there's a domestic violence situation, if there's obviously sexual harassment, sexual assault, economic problems, mental health problems, the Army and the military take those things very seriously, and they invest in their employees. You're not everybody's replaceable, but you're not replaceable, if you understand what I'm saying. So I know that just from talking to my daughter, that there are some situations where I question the professional integrity of that organization. Obviously, I won't say what organization that is, but they don't necessarily take care of their employees the way that the Army does.
Thank you so much. If Father Paul, I'm going to ask you a tough question, and you don't have to agree with the Colonel, but you could too. I'd love to get your thoughts on this, because you've been on both sides of the military-civilian equation. So do you believe the military is outperforming other large public and private sector employers when it comes to DEI? Or do you think the military is sort of struggling to the same extent that the corporate sector does to attract, retain, and promote diverse talent?
Yes, well, and certainly Colonel Payne has much more experience than I. My limited military experience, I would have to agree with Colonel Payne. I believe that the military, the Army, specifically where my experience is, actually does outperform the private sector in how it values diversity, equity, inclusion. And when I was in, I don't ever really remember people talking about diversity, equity, inclusion. It was simply the Army values that every soldier really is treated equally, that every soldier has the same opportunity for advancement, that also the Army, and with my experience, challenged any sort of beliefs to the contrary, that really devalued other soldiers, and the sense that we were all wearing the same color was certainly my experience in the military.
Thank you so much. Father Paul, follow up here. Data does show us that minority veterans often struggle at higher rates in their transition from the military to the community. As a Black man who's gone from serving your country to being such an incredible force for good in your community as CEO of the Neighborhood Resilience Project, sort of what would you like to see happen to improve those outcomes? Is it on the Department of Defense? Is it on the community? Sort of how do we make that better?
Well, I think that really the work for us to do as a society is really transitioning. How we help soldiers transition to civilian life is really the big question. And I think if we look at, we talk about minority veterans struggling when they're separated from service, I think it's important to understand that it could possibly, and I don't really know the data on this, but it could possibly be the case that many soldiers went into the service struggling, and they're simply going back to situations where they're perhaps where there's challenging economic circumstances, where the social networks might be fractured, where they just might not have the resources and opportunities that that other soldiers from other backgrounds may have. So I think we have as a society to look at that. I think it's, just as we look at the separation of minorities from the military, it's also, I think, important to understand that I think we are failing with also white service members as well, because this is where we begin to say that there's a disproportionate amount of military veterans in now domestic extremist organizations. And I think we have to ask the question, if we have minority veterans who are struggling, and we have white veterans who are not, certainly not, this isn't true across the board, but we do have disproportionate white veterans going into domestic extremist organizations, I think we have to say as a society, we are failing in terms of that transition in separation from service. And what we as a society do and take responsibility for is absolutely key, because ultimately I believe that extremism it deeply undermines especially soft American power, as we've seen over the past year. And I think it's a real challenge for us, certainly something that we need to address.
Thank you, Father Paul. All right, so one last question here to close us out before we take audience questions. I know we have 3 really great ones already. I'd like to close this question to all 3 of you. For decades now, and across the terms of many presidencies, America's military could be counted on to provide assistance to nations responding to national disasters, food insecurity, political turmoil. We've talked about much of that already today, regardless of whether or not the intervention served the interests of the United States. In recent years, however, many have started to argue that we should get our own house in order before we help others. So given all of your academic expertise and your life experiences, can you share your thoughts on what we lose if we shift towards a more isolationist approach? I don't know, Colonel Rossman, Mr. Rossman, I feel like you're well positioned to answer that, so I might start with you.
Thank you, Megan. In my opinion, we lose a lot if we turn away from the world. Helping others during their moments of greatest need is in our interest because it represents our values, our value of generosity. And it makes us friends and allies in the world. It's a good effect. U.S. foreign assistance, which I represent, is only 0.5% of the federal budget. And I recognize that each dollar is precious, but each small investment gains us goodwill and support of many people around the world in a very cost-effective and efficient way. And as a practical matter, if we do isolate ourselves, I believe this can only lead to resentment against us, which in no way reflects our values and our national aspirations. We want to be an example to others. We want to live our values. I just strongly believe that means we can never isolate ourselves. There's always a little bit that we can give to others, even if we are suffering a bit ourselves. So America being out there makes a safer world, makes a safer America. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Colonel, would you like to weigh in on that?
Sure. I believe as a nation, we have a lot of several unresolved issues and problems. There's no question about it. In all sectors of society and most communities throughout the United States, there are lots of problems where money could be well spent. However, the onset of the problems that we're facing now require global solutions. Whether or not you believe climate change is real, a lot of these things require global collaboration. The pandemic probably will not go away and will become the new normal. Response to natural disasters, just to name a few. And I believe that requires collective, we need to come to a collective solutions, global collaboration, sharing of resources. Now, obviously, we don't have unlimited resources in the United States. And obviously, the American people have their say. However, I agree with Mr. Rossman. To maintain our position in the world as a world leader, I think we need to lead the world through these problems. And I don't think taking an isolationist approach is optimal for the United States at this time.
Thank you. Father Paul, would you like to weigh in?
Yes, I agree with both Colonel Payne and Mr. Rossman. We have learned the lesson that isolationism is bad for the United States. If you look at really the 20th century, when we were in the early part of the 20th century, isolationism, that was our policy officially as a nation. And of course, what happened was World War I. The League of Nations fell apart in the aftermath of World War I, and then World War II happened. And then we have the United Nations. And if we compare the first half of the 20th century to the second half of the 20th century, that by the number of deaths that occurred. Think about the Spanish flu, in which there was not that level of international cooperation. Obviously the destruction, not only the death, but the destruction, every industrialized nation aside from the United States was destroyed in the Second World War. We've had violence, certainly, in the second half of the 20th century. We cannot, however, compare that to what happened in the first half of the 20th century. And that is in large part because of the international cooperation that existed in the aftermath of the Second World War. We mustn't repeat the mistakes of the past. We have learned this as a nation, given the realities that we're in, that global cooperation is necessary for the well-being of every human, including the United States of America.
Thank you all so much for your responses. I think we have a consensus on that one for sure. So we've officially reached the audience question and answer portion of our program. We do have some great questions already. Please continue to submit them if you have them. And I'm going to jump right in. And actually, I'm going to jump in with a question about COVID vaccines since it has just come up. Can you talk, Colonel Payne, Mr. Rossman, about maybe what the Department of Defense and USAID is doing right now to get COVID vaccines to the rest of the world?
I'd be happy to jump in. USAID is doing a lot. It's called vaccine diplomacy, if you want a term for it right now. Really what it is just trying to help others and also to help ourselves. As we know, variants can produce in other places, and if those individuals are vaccinated, it can actually curb the pandemic worldwide, protect people elsewhere, and protect the United States. Right now, we're donating very many vaccines. I believe we're up to about 1 billion doses have been promised around the world. And we're working with partner countries to deliver vaccine. We're also supporting Gavi, which is the Global Vaccine Initiative, in their efforts to support the world in receiving vaccines. So there's a very active policy, very active program at USAID for vaccines. Also providing support. We've been doing it since the beginning of the pandemic, before we had the vaccines, ranging from rearranging programs to say, given the nature of the pandemic, let's focus on the pandemic, from producing personal protective equipment to sharing knowledge, to sending ventilators earlier in the pandemic, to working with our partners, our allies, and sometimes not our allies because it's just humanitarian. So we're doing actually a great deal. And that also means there's a great deal more to be done, but the work continues. We're fully engaged, and much of the government is engaged, I might add.
The answer to this might be, Mr. Rossman, might be no, we don't know. But do we have a projection for when we feel like the world will be in a position that, for example, we are in the States where we have access to the vaccines and boosters? Is there a projected timeline where everyone will sort of have access to that, or most?
Megan, I don't have that information.
Okay.
I just know a lot of the international community is working full out, because it's from the health perspective, it's what needs to be done.
Sure.
And we are supporting it. I would like to, because I can't help myself, I'm in the Army War College and I represent the US government. There is a competition for vaccines as well. The Russians are providing their vaccine, the Chinese have a vaccine, we have our own, the Indians are providing vaccines. So it's important that we're in there demonstrating our values. I think we have some great vaccines, better than some of the other ones for that matter, which is a tribute to, as Father Paul mentioned, the ingenuity in our society. And we're not charging for this. There are some very poor places out there, and there are individuals who have that individual spark that we need to support, who will be receiving and are receiving those vaccines because of the goodwill of the American people, because of the goodwill of everyone who's listening to this podcast. Thank you. So this is a toss-up, and I think all three of you are well positioned to answer. It's a hard question, so say that up front. From our audience, how would you assess the outcomes of U.S. policies and efforts in Iraq and Afghanistan over the past 2 decades, areas where the U.S. government deployed a range of hard and soft power, including huge humanitarian, economic, and civil society development through provincial reconstruction teams? In both areas, the government's efforts were clearly not successful, but this is the question. And we expended a lot of blood and treasure. What lessons are we taking, I think, really from Iraq and Afghanistan?
I'll jump on that one. That's a long question. It's a great question. Sounds like an essay question is what it sounds like. But I'll speak on just based on my research, my personal experiences in Iraq and Afghanistan. Most recently, I was in Afghanistan. As I mentioned earlier, my focus was on counter-corruption. Unfortunately, corruption affects the perception of legitimacy for host nation governments. And when the local population believes that the host nation government lacks legitimacy, they turn to the alternative. And in this case, we kind of know who they turn to receive goods and services. Would I say that that blood and treasure was wasted? I would say no. I believe that the relationships that the international community, really not just the US Army, but the international community as a whole, as they responded to Iraq and Afghanistan, made very important linkages and relationships, really in attempting to install systems of accountability, honor, and transparency. In many cases, they didn't hold up, but it's not due to a lack of effort from the US military and the international military community, as well as the interagency efforts. But I think that some of that we just couldn't control. I would answer to the person that asked the question, is I think that there's a conflict of emotions for most service members who served in both of those places, as I did. And we've lost co-workers, teammates who are fathers, brothers, mothers, sisters to others. We left them there. And I will tell you that that for us personally, it was not in vain, and that the US military did the best that they could. But again, some of that is out of our control. Over.
Just open. Anyone else? You don't have to, but want to talk about lessons learned from Iraq and Afghanistan as it relates to hard and soft power and moving forward? If not,
I think it's a tough question, Megan. I just want to say, to echo Colonel Payne, that I pay the highest tribute to the U.S. service members who were there, our partner and ally service members, and to those who supported us, the host country individuals who supported our values of democracy, of free and transparent elections, of individual rights. I think the lessons are being drawn history doesn't repeat itself. I think in this case, thank goodness, sometimes it rhymes. Yes. So I think there's lessons that we are drawing, say at USAID, we made improvements in the work that we did. I'm an optimist. I wouldn't do the work I did if I wasn't an optimist. There are signs there that maybe there are good things that happened. In Iraq just last year, there were democratic elections, which changed things around. We didn't hear much about that here, but it was for the Iraqis something extraordinary, that they could actually have their own successful elections. So Iraq as a country is going through a journey. I don't think they went backwards. I think they're actually moving forwards and establishing themselves. It's early days for Afghanistan. From my perspective at USAID, I'm guided by the president, but I don't know that our work is done in Afghanistan. There's a whole generation of individuals who have benefited from our presence. So many women who are educated, health improvements. The story's not over yet, perhaps. Maybe the military side is, it's time to move to the longer term, as I talked with Ukraine, the longer term aspects of the soft power of maybe we can start bringing things to a place which is better for the average Afghan and better for the security of the free world.
Father Paul, did you want to weigh in with something?
Well, I would just simply say I appreciate the comments of Colonel Payne and Mr. Rossman. Certainly, I think for me, one of the big lessons is we have to be very careful to really view the world through a black and white lens. I think when I reflect on how some of our experience in the Middle East was, or in Central Asia, really this idea that people are either good or bad, or they're they're the good guys or the bad guys. We just have to eliminate that. In the aftermath of the invasion of Iraq and how, people were looking at Baathists as, these guys became disenfranchised. They were separated. They would eventually become the backbone of the insurgency. Many foreign fighters would come in and join the insurgency. But I think this idea that the Baathists were all bad is a real problem. And I think it's continued after the war in Iraq. The position we've taken in Syria, which was impacted by the war of Iraq, the rise of ISIS. Al-Baghdadi was in an American prisoner of war camp, right? The rise of ISIS and how that impacted Syria. And I think this idea that the regime in Syria is just all bad. But when we look at the incredibly complex environment of the Middle East, we have to be more nuanced and how we understand who really are allies and enemies. And I think we have to move, a little more gently as it relates to building these relationships, because I think the result of these military actions is it's shown the world the limitations of American power, which has ultimately, I think, undermined our position globally. That's what I would argue. So I think we have a lot of work to do in terms of, the final thing I'll say is that the world is not the same world it was in 1900. Since, again, the First World War, this idea of self-determination of a people this is why the colonies fell apart in the aftermath, again, of the First and Second World War, because people now are of the idea that they're not going to be ruled. This perception of being ruled by foreign powers is something that people around the world reject in a way that was not happening in the 1800s. And so I think really understanding this requires, again, a more nuanced approach to engaging very challenging environments around the world.
Thank you, Father Paul. We have about 9 minutes. I'm sorry, I'm lying. We have less than that. We have 6 minutes and 3 really good questions, audience questions. So I'm going to try to get to as many I can. Another tough one. I like the framing. This is what the audience member says. I like the framing of this panel focused on how U.S. strengths impact international relations and national security. But what about U.S. weakness? I think there is general recognition that our democracy has become incredibly and increasingly polarized. How might that impact our national security? Anyone?
I'll jump on that one first. I'll just give a very brief explanation and then I'll hand it back to you. I think it just affects our ability to impart soft power. I think that that culturally, that when other nations look at the United States and they see that we are extremely polarized, that it does take away from our influence. I don't think it's going to change anytime soon. It may never change. It may take a generation plus for this to change back. but at some point, every topic that is put on the table, whether it's the pandemic, whether it's climate change, has become a topic for political polarization. So I do think that is potentially a weakness, and that is an area where an enemy could sow dissension within our population, whether through social media or some other means of influence. And that is a weakness of the United States. Mr. Rossman, I'll hand it to you.
Thank you. Just very quickly, I would tend to like to frame this as challenges. We have challenges in the United States. I'd like to fall back on what I've always, which is the truth. We're the American experiment. We've never been perfect. We've made many missteps. We've made mistakes, but we're always working towards something better, more equality, more diversity, more representation, a more perfect union. I believe that we can face these challenges. Right now, I believe we're experiencing a time of hyper change. The rise of social media, a change in world power, if you will, moving more towards Asia from Europe, and that we have to hold to our values. There will be challenges along the way, from attacks on the Capitol to what have you. But I remain an optimist that if we stick to our values, if we have discussions like this, that we accept different perspectives, but we accept process, that we will do fine. These challenges are, yes, perhaps weakening us overseas short term, but again, I think we will work our way through the ingenuity again that Father Paul mentioned before. We'll keep working it through, and that's our commitment to that experiment. I think that will bring us through this, and we'll demonstrate to the world that our values are something that are worth looking at, supporting, and perhaps emulating. Thank you.
Okay, I'm going to make this our last question. I think, Father Paul, you might be well positioned to answer it, but I'm not. But if anyone else feels more strongly, jump in. So here's an audience question. You've touched on global solutions and acting as a world leader. Can you tie those notions into things like immigration and refugee resettlement? How does it look to find global solutions and then be a world leader within the United States to uphold those values in the United States that we attempt to share and do share globally?
This is a really important question. I think it, I think in many respects, the big challenge that we have, to be quite honest with you, in the history of the United States, and I believe it's perhaps our biggest threat. It is the presence of white supremacy in the United States. I'm not talking about simply, racism. I really am talking about white supremacy. If we talk about even at the Second Continental Congress, in really the brutal debate that ensued about slavery that resulted in the 3/5 compromise. We talk about the Civil War, where we have U.S. military officers, General Robert E. Lee, who was first offered command of the United States Army before he resigned and became a Confederate general, right? And we talk about, the rise of Jim Crow, et cetera, and how that impacts our domestic policies around refugee resettlement in the United States in the context of the broader soft power, the values we're trying to communicate around the world. It's a significant it's been a significant challenge for us. It's an irony for us. We in the United States have immigrants have we talk about the ingenuity of the United States. Immigrants in large part have fueled that ingenuity in the United States, that diverse perspective, being able, even from a military perspective. I remember reading an article about special forces in the height of the Cold War, that someone was referring to the special forces as, essentially a microcosm of the United Nations, because there were so many people from different countries who had the cultural, linguistic skills that particular military operation required, the diversity that really strengthens our position. And ultimately, white supremacy, and I really am talking about white supremacy as a political identity that I believe fueled the January 6th insurrection. And so much of, many of the challenges we're facing now is what at the same time prevents us from being responsible leaders in the refugee resettlement issue.
Thank you so much. Definitely a challenge for us to really dig in on. And of course, it's an enduring one. I'm going to end there. And thank you so much to the panelists, to my panelists today. You guys were incredible. I was so honored to be a part of this. And Betty, I'm going to turn it back over to you to close us out. Thank you so much.
Thank you, everyone. We are at time and we could keep going because those questions and comments kept coming in. So sorry if we didn't have time to get to your question, but the conversation will continue throughout the year. Please continue to join us. Thank you to our terrific speakers, Colonel Payne, Mike Rossman, Father Abernathy, our superstar moderator, Megan Andros. Thank you so much. Thanks to the U.S. Army War College for your partnership on today's program. Please follow us on social media to stay up to date on our future programs. And our programs are made possible thanks to the generosity of donors. So please consider making a donation to support our work at worldpittsburgh.org. Thank you all. Until next time.